There's some really strong points to the game and a few things that I think really detract from the whole experience. So let's start off with the things I like. The entire game thus far seems to have interconnectivity the likes of which hasn't been seen since Dark Souls 1, and I'm a fan of that. In fact, if I had to describe the entire thing, I would say it's like Dark Souls 1 and Bloodborne had a kid, and then that kid got raised by adoptive Chinese parents. Every competent Souls-like tries to put their own spin on the shtick as a whole, and Wuchang does that in the way of the Skyborn Might system. Usually, or most commonly, you're going to get charges of Skyborn Might for perfect dodges, but again, depending upon what sort of weapon you're using, that's also going to give you options for combos that will generate anywhere between 1 and 3 Skyborn Might. So basically, it's a build and spend mechanic on top of a heavy emphasis on perfect dodges a la Bloodborne. Some of the weapons do have parries, one specific set of dual blades, and the longsword as a whole. However, those are tied to specific skills, not the weapon itself. Except for those dual blades, that's actually a weapon skill. A lot of the reviews I've seen, on Steam or Reddit or just general chatter in those places as well, likes to complain about the combat feeling floaty. Maybe it's because I'm leaning hard into axe and dual blades from my playthrough, but that is most certainly not the case in my experience. I haven't tried spear. Maybe that's the thing there. I don't know. But floaty is certainly not how I would describe the combat. Overall, the level design seems to lean much more in that classic Souls vibe, where the levels themselves are the primary threat, not specific bosses or boss encounters as a general rule. A couple notable difficulty spikes notwithstanding, the commander, in fact, is likely where many people are going to get stopped. In fact, on my playthrough, I did wind up respeccing from axe over to dual blades just to abuse the clash mechanic and R1 spam her to death. Now, depending upon how you feel about that, you're either going to really like it or really hate it, because the levels themselves are the primary threat, and they're really a test of your endurance and ability to not only preserve your own resources, but know when to push further and risk things and not. There is a staggering amount of exploration, and the reward for that exploration is, in part and par with all the effort that goes into it. Sure, you could probably bum rush the story, and, if you're a parry and dodge god, just walk over bosses and do the equivalent of a level 1 no-hit run. Sure. Or you can actually take a look at all of the different side paths and explore and get all the upgrades and experience a really nice power curve. Accepting the possibility to sequence break the game, from the first to the second area there's an opportunity to take a hard right and go down a ladder, and you'll actually wind up in the third area, which I did. Granted, I'm also the guy that turned left at Firelink Shrine and wondered why all the skellies in the catacombs were so difficult. Now, in this playthrough, that actually kind of worked in my favor, in a weird way, because I cleared out what I'm assuming is the first half of the third zone, got all the way to a rather difficult boss, attempted that for a little bit, realized I'd screwed something up along the way, and in a place I shouldn't have been. But throughout that process, we did get a grip of upgrade materials, and got like 7 or 8 levels in the course of an hour. It's silly. And when I went back to the zone that we were supposed to do next, after clearing that first one, things were kind of squishy. We were just going back to 1 and 2 shotting things, which was admittedly a little bit anticlimactic, but having a break, especially after accidentally skipping an entire chapter of the game, that's nice. Suffice to say, you're unlikely to get hard stopped by a boss. Absolute worst case scenario, go grind some levels, come back a bit stronger, rework your build, maybe try a different weapon. Some bosses are much easier with one weapon versus another. Another thing I really like is the depth of build crafting on offer, because in addition to each of the different weapons, each weapon has its own unique skill tree, which includes things like base stats, and you can pick and choose from each weapon tree to stack the stats you're after, as well as unique discipline skills, which you can replace the left trigger skill on any of the weapons you're using. So weapons come with one unique skill baked in, and then another one that you can replace with something from that weapon's tree. Now, depending on which weapon you're using, there are some clear standouts here. Some of those are going to be more effective than others. Looking at you, the Blade Dancer perk, Blade Master? Blade Dancer? One of the two, on dual blades. Just because the amount of regen you get off of clashes and the accelerated moveset kinda makes dual blades silly. So if you're the type that really enjoys build crafting, there's opportunity to break the game here. Nice. If we were going to play Souls-likes on a spectrum, right? On one hand, you have the very pure Souls of like Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 3, and then on the far other side, you have things like Nioh, which lean much more into that almost Diablo-esque style of loot and build crafting and grinding. I would say Wuchang falls like maybe 1 or 2 steps off of that Dark Souls 1 or 3 end of the spectrum, because it is a very strict Souls-like in that there isn't a whole lot of, variance to the loot. Things are static. It's about how you put those things together in terms of the specific resistances and defenses. Resistances do actually matter in this game, as well as the unique talent points that you put together through your build as you level. So for people who want a little bit more out of a Souls-like without descending into the I'm going to go kill this boss 8,000 times hoping for a 4% drop nature of Nioh, you're in luck. By contrast, people who really enjoy that aspect of games like Nioh or Kazan, you're probably not going to like this. Level and enemy design is solid from what I've seen so far. There's that degree of interconnectivity and side paths that actually lead to me getting lost quite frequently, which is nice because more recently we've gotten a lot of very linear Souls-likes. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a self-contained experience, but it's nice to wander around and be like, wait, where the hell am I? And more importantly, how do I get back to the stain that used to be my corpse that has all of my XP? Enemies seem to run the gamut, from random crunchy mercenary with a stick all the way up to horrifying Last of Us-esque explodey zombies and horrifying monsters. It's a really nice blend. In terms of things I was kind of lukewarm about, the quest design is very classic Souls. Exhaust all the dialogue options with every NPC you encounter, or miss quests and subsequently miss potential endings, or items, or things like that. If I know that's what I'm getting into, I can tolerate that and lean in to experience the game on its terms. If it's something that bothers you, you much prefer having a far more hand-holdy experience, like go to the thing, do the thing, that might grate against you here. Overall, at least in New Game, there does seem to be some starvation in and around the mid-game with the XP and your available talent points. Unless you decide to go farming, or sequence break the game like I did. Sure, there's more than enough points to spec out one weapon and pick up the universal tree to get, upgrades to your healing amount and number of uses and like extra temperance and things like that. So that's fine, but again, there are specific points in the game where you're gonna want to swap to a different weapon just because it's easier or more effective. And while you can respec for free, which is great at any point in time, at any bonfire equivalent, so I'm certainly not complaining there, that opens up so much opportunity for experimentation without having to level a brand new character. Gold star. At the same time, though, it is kind of a pain to respec all of those points and then put it into a different weapon, go kill that boss, leave, respec, go back to your original build. I think perhaps another way they could have navigated that would be to have 2 separate talent trees, kind of like the way Path of Exile does it, where depending upon which weapon you have equipped determines what your talent tree looks like. Now, I don't know if that's the kind of thing that they can patch in after the fact, but it would be cool. That said, I'm lukewarm about it. It's not like I'm, over here pulling my hair out. I mean, that ship has sailed a long time ago. Sound design is another thing I can either take or leave here. There really weren't any memorable, bombastic standout moments the way you would get a la Souls or Elden Ring, at least in terms of, overall environmental sound or weapon sound or like background music or swells or things like that. If that ambiance is a thing that you very strongly value, just know that that's perhaps where they didn't spend the majority of their time. I could also take or leave the madness system. Like, on one hand, maxing out your madness while you're farming for the extra souls, that's nice. As for bosses, though, if you're already banging your head against a wall of a boss and filling up your madness meter, the extra damage that you do doesn't necessarily make up for the extra damage you're taking. So this necessitates some artificial deaths so that you can clear your madness, go kill your inner demon and whatnot, and then go back to not taking 20% extra damage. Annoying. Again, not a deal breaker for me, at least. Now, on to things I actively disliked. There are 4 quick slots. One of those always needs to be your healing item. One of those needs to be your temperance. So that basically leaves you 2. Either for, status clearing items or additional healing items in case you decide you just want to try to bum rush a boss and unga bunga through the damage and not care, which you can do with some of the bosses, just not all of them. A few in particular, you're going to have a bad time if you try that. I don't really understand why it would be limited to 4 unless they were trying to force some very specific choices there, which if so, that's a valid design decision. I just personally dislike it. On one hand, yeah, it's annoying having to hit up or down on the D-pad 12 times to get the thing you want. So only ever having 4 makes that simpler. But maybe 6 would be cool, because then you can have the things that are mandatory and a decent collection of other tools as needed. So this next one comes with a giant asterisk, or 2, actually. Performance. If you look online, either Steam or Reddit or wherever, you would think that this game is unoptimized all to hell, runs just as poorly as Wilds, blah, 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 right? What I dislike about the performance were the hours of tweaking and testing I needed to do with my setup to make the game run well. Now, since I've done that, I'm holding a consistent 90 to 100 frames without frame gen. Granted, I am on a 4090, so I would be surprised if I'm not getting that, but even while recording locally, if I turn on frame gen, I'm getting 8 milliseconds of latency per frame, and it's staying pegged between 130 and 140 frames per second, which is more than adequate for a game of this type. So, on the note of performance, there's a couple things you need to do. First, force either the newest version of DLSS or FSR through your driver. If you're on NVIDIA, easiest way to do this is with DLSS Swapper or NVIDIA Profile Inspector. Second, you're going to go ahead and enable resizable bar in your BIOS if it isn't already. And then you're going to turn that on in your video card drivers, just so your CPU can use more of your VRAM if you're lucky enough to have more than 8 gigs. Following that, you're going to disable global illumination in-game. Yes, this is going to make it look a little bit worse. But the global illumination is the software version implementation of Lumen, which is going to make it a stuttery mess. Yes, even on a 4090. Now, the 1.3 patch we got yesterday morning on both Steam and Game Pass has made some improvements to overall performance, VRAM usage, things like that. So this last one may not be necessary. I have it in there just because I'd patched it earlier. I'm not going to go back and change stuff now because it works. And the little bit of shadow flickering that it introduces in the snowy region doesn't really bother me. I'm going to leave a link in the description and or pinned comment if I feel like being an overachiever to an engine.ini tweak. Pretty standard fare for UE5 games, but the link to Nexus mods will be down there. That said, it is still a UE5 game, and it comes with all of the trappings and problems that UE5 normally has. So, knowing your machine, you may not be able to run this until they patch it further, if they can. In the meantime, what I would suggest is if you have Game Pass, try it there, because at least as of the date of this record, shockingly, the Game Pass version and the Steam version have parity. So you can test how it'll run. If you don't have Game Pass, make use of the 2-hour Steam refund window. I would suggest, doing all of those other tweaks that I'd suggested first before you boot up the game, so that you can get a clear picture of what you're working with, instead of spending some time dealing with cutscenes and figuring out how to even use the game, and where you can find demanding areas to really strain your GPU without chewing up too terribly much of the refund window. In terms of a lot of the other chatter you might see online about it, I think it released to, if not mostly negative, then overwhelmingly negative on Steam. Some of that is deserved because of the UE5 implementation. Some of that is people not using the current drivers or knowing how to tweak their PC. That's not inherently their fault. We can't blame people for not knowing what they don't know. That's part of why I include the very step-by-step process of what you need to do to fix it. Another part, though, is related to what the game is portraying. So, yes, obviously, this is an allegory for a portion of history as told through the lens of dark fantasy and, servicing the broader narrative that the designers wanted to play, right? So taking what I know of Chinese history and some liberal use of Google Translate, looking at Steam comments, because it's been 19 years since I've had occasion to use Mandarin on a semi-regular basis, so we're leaning on Google Translate a bit. The game's set at that transition between the Ming and Qing dynasties. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar, the Ming dynasty was culturally and ethnically Han. The Qing dynasty was culturally and ethnically Manchu, what is modern-day Sichuan. Suffice to say, those groups do not get along, historically speaking, and that transition from the Han to the Manchu dynasties, anything that portrays the Han group in a questionable or anything but positive light generally doesn't float well with a significant portion of modern China, which retains a strong cultural Han heritage. So a good chunk of the review bombing is complaining about that. But, that's not a thing you would know necessarily as random gamer who doesn't understand Chinese or has Chinese history and socio-political stuff circling around in their head. Socio-political stuff. I love how we go from talking about history and culture deep cuts to using stuff in the same sentence. Thanks, brain. But all in all, if we're talking about strict Souls-likes, things like Kazan and Neo can go have their own space because they're not Souls-likes. They're their own unique thing that deserves space and to be considered in the context of the game world system that they're building. But in terms of strict Souls-likes, this is, to me at least, one of the better ones in recent memory. It gives me that original, interconnectivity and sense of exploration and scale and scope of Dark Souls 1 and 3. 1, of course, being more open world and interconnected than 3, and that's at the same time it's delivering, competent combat and systems that allow for personalization and unique play styles and, many different ways of skinning the same cat. I like it. So in terms of whether or not I think it's worth your time and money, well, I've put an irresponsible amount of hours into it in the last 3 days, so clearly I like it. If you have Game Pass, by all means, play it there. Then you're only out time if it doesn't work on your machine or if it's not your cup of tea. If you don't have Game Pass, well, it might be worth seeing if you can spring for a month and make use of the discount codes that float around the internet. Or, if you're just morally opposed to Game Pass, I would say it's worth full price, which I believe is $50 at this point. For the regular edition, not the deluxe with the extra fancy skins and whatnot. You're gonna get, most likely, between 30 and 50 hours at a minimum of entertainment out of the game. That most certainly fits in with the burrito index. I'm a fan. I think if some of the rough edges can get sanded down, you might be too. Anyhow, I'm curious what you think. Let me know if those tweaks that I mentioned in the performance section actually got you some more frames or at least helped alleviate some of the stutters. If I missed anything that is egregious, that you're just like, wow, how could you not mention X? It was so awful. Or, oh my God, Y was great. Why didn't you mention Y? Let me know. Comments. Do your thing. I've been Baldsquid. I'll see you next time.